World War I, often abbreviated as WWI or WWUWI or WW1, also known as the First World War or the Great War, was an international conflict that began on July 28, 1914 and ended on November 11, 1918. It involved much of Europe, as well as Russia, the United States and Turkey, and was also fought in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia. One of the deadliest conflicts in history, an estimated 9 million were killed in combat, while over 5 million civilians died from occupation, bombardment, hunger, or disease. The genocides perpetrated by the Ottomans and the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic spread by the movement of combatants during the war caused many millions of additional deaths worldwide. In 1914, the great powers were divided into two opposing alliances, the Triple Entente, consisting of France, Russia, and Britain, and the Triple Alliance, made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Tensions in the Balkans came to a head on June 28, 1914 following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian heir, by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, and the interlocking alliances involved the powers in a series of diplomatic exchanges known as the July Crisis. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia came to Serbia's defense, and by August 4, the conflict had expanded to include Germany, France, and Britain, along with their respective colonial empires. In November, the Ottoman Empire, Germany, and Austria formed the Central Powers, while in April 1915, Italy joined Britain, France, Russia, and Serbia as the Allied powers. Facing a war on two fronts, German strategy in 1914 was to defeat France, then shift its forces to the east and knock out Russia, commonly known as the Schlieffen Plan. This failed when their advance into France was halted at the Marne. By the end of 1914, the two sides faced each other along the Western Front, a continuous series of trench lines stretching from the Channel to Switzerland that changed little until 1917. By contrast, the Eastern Front was far more fluid, with Austria-Hungary and Russia gaining, then losing large swathes of territory. Other significant theaters included the Middle East, the Alpine Front and the Balkans, bringing Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece into the war. Shortages caused by the Allied naval blockade led Germany to initiate unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, bringing the previously neutral United States into the war on April 6, 1917. In Russia, the Bolsheviks seized power in the 1917 October Revolution and made peace in the March 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, freeing up large numbers of German troops. By transferring these to the Western Front, the German General Staff hoped to win a decisive victory before American reinforcements could impact the war, and launched the March 1918 German Spring Offensive. Despite initial success, it was soon halted by heavy casualties and ferocious defense. In August, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, and although the German army continued to fight hard, it could no longer halt their advance. The Central Powers began to collapse. Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29, followed by the Ottomans on October 31, then Austria-Hungary on November 3. Isolated, facing revolution at home and an army on the verge of mutiny, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated on November 9 and the new German government signed the Armistice of November 11, 1918, bringing the fighting to a close. The 1919 Paris Peace Conference imposed various settlements on the defeated powers, the best known being the Treaty of Versailles. The dissolution of the Russian, German, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires led to numerous uprisings and the creation of independent states, including Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. For reasons that are still debated, failure to manage the instability that resulted from this upheaval during the interwar period ended with the outbreak of World War II in 1939.
The term World War was first coined in September 1914 by German biologist and philosopher Ernst Haeckel. He claimed that, there is no doubt that the course and character of the feared European war will become the First World War in the full sense of the word, citing a wire service report in the Indianapolis Star on September 20, 1914. Prior to World War II, the events of 1914 to 1918 were generally known as the Great War or simply the World War. In October 1914, the Canadian magazine Maclean's wrote, "Some wars name themselves. This is the Great War." Contemporary Europeans also referred to it as the war to end war, or the war to end all wars, due to their perception of its then unparalleled scale and devastation. After World War II began in 1939, the terms became more standard, with British Empire historians, including Canadians, favoring the First World War and Americans World War I.
For much of the 19th century, the major European powers maintained a tenuous balance of power among themselves, known as the Concert of Europe. After 1848, this was challenged by a variety of factors, including Britain's withdrawal into so-called splendid isolation, the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Prussia under Otto von Bismarck. The 1866 Austro-Prussian War established Prussian hegemony in Germany, while victory in the 1870–1871 Franco-Prussian War allowed Bismarck to consolidate the German states into a German empire under Prussian leadership. Avenging the defeat of 1871, or revanchism, and recovering the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine became the principal objects of French policy for the next 40 years. In order to isolate France and avoid a war on two fronts, Bismarck negotiated the League of the Three Emperors, German, Dreikaiserbund, between Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany. After Russian victory in the 1877–1878 Russo-Turkish War, the League was dissolved due to Austrian concerns over Russian influence in the Balkans, an area they considered of vital strategic interest. Germany and Austria-Hungary then formed the 1879 Dual Alliance, which became the Triple Alliance when Italy joined in 1882. For Bismarck, the purpose of these agreements was to isolate France by ensuring the three empires resolved any disputes between themselves. When this was threatened in 1880 by British and French attempts to negotiate directly with Russia, he reformed the League in 1881, which was renewed in 1883 and 1885. After the agreement lapsed in 1887, he replaced it with the Reinsurance Treaty, a secret agreement between Germany and Russia to remain neutral if either were attacked by France or Austria-Hungary. Bismarck viewed peace with Russia as the foundation of German foreign policy, but after becoming Kaiser in 1890, Wilhelm II forced him to retire and was persuaded not to renew the Reinsurance Treaty by Leo von Caprivi, his new chancellor. This provided France an opportunity to counteract the Triple Alliance, by signing the Franco-Russian Alliance in 1894, followed by the 1904 Entente Cordiale with Britain, and the Triple Entente was completed by the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention. While these were not formal alliances, by settling long-standing colonial disputes in Africa and Asia, British entry into any future conflict involving France or Russia became a possibility. British and Russian support for France against Germany during the Agadir crisis in 1911 reinforced their relationship and increased Anglo-German estrangement, deepening the divisions that would erupt in 1914.
Creation of a unified Reich, along with indemnity payments imposed on France and the acquisition of important coal and iron deposits in the annexed provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, fueled an economic boom and huge increase in German industrial strength. With the backing of Wilhelm II, after 1890 Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz sought to exploit this growth to create a Kaiser-like Marine, or Imperial German Navy, able to compete with the British Royal Navy for world naval supremacy. He was greatly influenced by U.S. naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued possession of a blue water navy was vital for global power projection. Tirpitz had his books translated into German, while Wilhelm made them required reading for his advisors and senior military personnel. However, it was also an emotional decision, driven by Wilhelm's simultaneous admiration for the Royal Navy and his desire to outdo it. Bismarck stressed the need to avoid antagonizing Britain, a policy made easier by his opposition to acquiring colonies, but this challenge could not be ignored and resulted in the Anglo-German naval arms race. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 gave the British a technological advantage over their German rival which they never lost. Ultimately, the race diverted huge resources to creating a German navy large enough to antagonize Britain, but not defeat it. In 1911, Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg acknowledged defeat, leading to the Rüstungswende or armaments turning point, when he switched expenditure from the navy to the army. This was driven by concern over Russia's recovery from defeat in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War and the subsequent revolution. Economic reforms backed by French funding led to a significant post-1908 expansion of railways and infrastructure, particularly in its western border regions. Germany and Austria-Hungary relied on faster mobilization to compensate for fewer numbers, and it was the potential threat posed by the closing of this gap that led to the end of the naval race, rather than a reduction in tensions. When Germany expanded its standing army by 170,000 men in 1913, France extended compulsory military service from 2 to 3 years, similar measures taken by the Balkan powers and Italy, which led to increased expenditure by the Ottomans and Austria-Hungary. Absolute figures are hard to calculate due to differences in categorizing expenditure, since they often omit civilian infrastructure projects with a military use, such as railways. However, from 1908 to 1913, defense spending by the 6 major European powers increased by over 50% in real terms.
Conflicts in the Balkans. Photo of large white building with one sign saying, Moritz Schiller, and another in Arabic. In front is a cluster of people looking at poster on the wall. Sarajevo citizens reading a poster with the proclamation of the Austrian annexation in 1908. The years before 1914 were marked by a series of crises in the Balkans as other powers sought to benefit from Ottoman decline. While Pan-Slavic and Orthodox Russia considered itself the protector of Serbia and other Slav states, the strategic importance of the Bosporus Straits meant they preferred these be controlled by a weak Ottoman government, rather than an ambitious power like Bulgaria. Balancing these competing objectives required simultaneously backing their clients while limiting their territorial gains, dividing Russian policy makers and adding to the instability of this region. At the same time, many Austrian statesmen considered the Balkans essential for the continued existence of their empire, and Serbian expansion as a direct threat to it. The 1908 to 1909 Bosnian crisis began when Austria annexed the former Ottoman territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which it had occupied since 1878. Timed to coincide with the Bulgarian declaration of independence from the Ottoman Empire, this unilateral action was denounced by all the great powers. Unable to reverse it, they amended the 1878 Treaty of Berlin and accepted Austrian annexation. Some historians see this as a significant escalation, ending any chance of Russia and Austria cooperating in the Balkans, while damaging Austrian relations with Serbia and Italy, who had their own expansionist ambitions in the area. Tensions were further heightened by the 1911 to 1912 Italo-Turkish War, which demonstrated the apparent inability of the Ottomans to retain their empire and led to the formation of the Balkan League 30, an alliance of Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece. The League overran most of European Turkey in the 1912 to 1913 First Balkan War. Despite its decline, the great powers had assumed the Ottoman army was powerful enough to defeat the League, and its collapse took them by surprise. 31 The Serbian capture of ports on the Adriatic resulted in partial Austrian mobilization on November 21, 1912, including units along the Russian border in Galicia. When the Council of Ministers of the Russian Empire met to consider their response next day, they decided not to mobilize, fearing Germany would do the same and start a European war for which they were not yet prepared. The great powers sought to reassert control through the 1913 Treaty of London, which created an independent Albania, while enlarging the territories of Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece. However, disputes between the victors sparked the 33-day Second Balkan War. When Bulgaria attacked Serbia and Greece on June 16, 1913, it was defeated, losing most of Macedonia to Serbia and Greece, and southern Dobruja to Romania. 33 The result was that even countries which benefited from the Balkan Wars, such as Serbia and Greece, felt cheated of their rightful gains, while for Austria it demonstrated the apparent indifference with which other powers viewed their concerns, including Germany. 34 This complex mix of resentment, nationalism, and insecurity help explain why the pre-1914 Balkans became known as the powder keg of Europe.
Sarajevo assassination. Main article, Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Traditionally thought to show the arrest of Gavrilo Princip, right, historians now believe it depicts an innocent bystander, Ferdinand Baer. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir presumptive to Emperor Franz Joseph, visited Sarajevo, capital of the recently annexed provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. 6 assassins from the movement known as Young Bosnia, or Mlada Bosna, took up positions along the route taken by the Archduke's motorcade, with the intention of assassinating him. Supplied with arms by extremists within the Serbian Black Hand intelligence organization, they hoped his death would free Bosnia from Austrian rule, although there was little agreement on what would replace it. Nedeljko Kabranovic threw a grenade at the Archduke's car and injured 2 of his aides, who were taken to hospital while the convoy carried on. The other assassins were also unsuccessful, but an hour later, as Ferdinand was returning from visiting the injured officers, his car took a wrong turn into a street where Gavrilo Princip was standing. He stepped forward and fired 2 pistol shots, fatally wounding Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, who both died shortly thereafter. Although Emperor Franz Joseph was shocked by the incident, political and personal differences meant the 2 men were not close. Allegedly, his first reported comment was, "A higher power has re-established the order which I, alas, could not preserve." According to historian Zbigniew Zeman, his reaction was reflected more broadly in Vienna, where the event almost failed to make any impression whatsoever. On Sunday, June 28 and Monday 29, the crowds listened to music and drank wine, as if nothing had happened. Nevertheless, the impact of the murder of the heir to the throne was significant, and has been described by historian Christopher Clark as a 9/11 effect, a terrorist event charged with historic meaning, transforming the political chemistry in Vienna.
Expansion of violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Crowds on the streets in the aftermath of the anti-Serb riots in Sarajevo, June 29, 1914. The Austro-Hungarian authorities encouraged the subsequent anti-Serb riots in Sarajevo, in which Bosnian Croats and Bosniaks killed 2 Bosnian Serbs and damaged numerous Serb-owned buildings. Violent actions against ethnic Serbs were also organized outside Sarajevo, in other cities in Austro-Hungarian-controlled Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. Austro-Hungarian authorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina imprisoned and extradited approximately 5,500 prominent Serbs, 700 to 2,200 of whom died in prison. A further 460 Serbs were sentenced to death. A predominantly Bosniak special militia known as the Schutzkorps was established and carried out the persecution of Serbs.
July Crisis. The assassination initiated the July Crisis, a month of diplomatic maneuvering between Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain. Correctly believing intelligence officials from the Black Hand were involved in the plot to murder the Archduke, Austria wanted to end Serbian interference in Bosnia and believed war was the best way to achieve this. However, the Austrian-Hungarian Foreign Ministry had no proof of Serbian involvement, and a dossier belatedly compiled to make its case was riddled with errors. On July 23, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, listing 10 demands made intentionally unacceptable to provide an excuse for starting hostilities. Serbia ordered general mobilization on July 25, but accepted all the terms, except for those empowering Austrian representatives to suppress subversive elements inside Serbia, and take part in the investigation and trial of Serbians linked to the assassination. Claiming this amounted to a wholesale rejection, Austria broke off diplomatic relations and ordered partial mobilization the next day. On July 28, they declared war on Serbia and started shelling Belgrade. Having initiated war preparations on July 25, Russia now ordered general mobilization in support of Serbia on 30. Anxious to ensure backing from the SDP political opposition by presenting Russia as the aggressor, Bethmann Hollweg delayed commencement of war preparations until July 31. That afternoon the Russian government was given an ultimatum, requiring they cease all war measures against Germany and Austria-Hungary within 12 hours. Germany also demanded assurances France would remain neutral. The French refused and ordered general mobilization but delayed declaring war. In reality, the German General Staff had long assumed a war on 2 fronts. Originally completed in 1905, the Schlieffen Plan envisaged the bulk of the army would be used to defeat France in 4 weeks, before doing the same to Russia. In accordance with this, mobilization orders were issued that afternoon. Cheering crowds in London and Paris on the day war was declared. At a meeting on July 29, the British cabinet had narrowly decided its obligations to Belgium under the 1839 Treaty of London did not require it to oppose a German invasion with military force. However, this was largely driven by Prime Minister Asquith's desire to maintain unity. He and his senior cabinet ministers were already committed to support France, the Royal Navy had been mobilized and public opinion was strongly in favor of intervention. On July 31, Britain sent notes to Germany and France, asking them to respect Belgian neutrality. France pledged to do so, Germany did not reply. Once the German ultimatum to Russia expired on the morning of August 1, the two countries were at war. Later the same day, Wilhelm was informed by his ambassador in London, Prince Lichnowsky, that Britain would remain neutral if France was not attacked, and in any case might be stayed by a crisis in Ireland. Jubilant at this news, he ordered General Moltke, the German chief of staff, to march the whole of the army to the east. Moltke protested that it cannot be done. The deployment of millions cannot be improvised. Lichnowsky, in any case, quickly realized he was mistaken. Although Wilhelm insisted on waiting for a telegram from his cousin George V, once received, it confirmed there had been a misunderstanding and he told Moltke, "Now do what you want." French intelligence was well aware of German plans to attack through Belgium, and their commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, asked that his troops be allowed to cross the border to preempt such a move. This was rejected by the French government, in part to avoid antagonizing the British, and Joffre was told any advance into Belgium could come only after a German invasion. On August 2, Germany occupied Luxembourg and exchanged fire with French units. On August 3, they declared war on France and demanded the Belgians allow them unimpeded right-of-way, which was refused. Early on the morning of August 4, the Germans invaded. Albert I of Belgium ordered his army to resist and called for assistance under the Treaty of London. Britain sent Germany an ultimatum demanding they respect Belgian neutrality and withdraw, which expired at midnight without a response. Germany was now at war with Britain and its global empire.
Progress of the war. Opening hostilities. Confusion among the Central Powers. The strategy of the Central Powers suffered from miscommunication. Germany had promised to support Austria-Hungary's invasion of Serbia, but interpretations of what this meant differed. Previously tested deployment plans had been replaced early in 1914, but those had never been tested in exercises. Austro-Hungarian leaders believed Germany would cover its northern flank against Russia. Germany, however, envisioned Austria-Hungary directing most of its troops against Russia, while Germany dealt with France. This confusion forced the Austro-Hungarian army to divide its forces between the Russian and Serbian fronts. Serbian campaign. Beginning on August 12, the Austrian and Serbs clashed at the battles of the Ser and Kolyabara. Over the next 2 weeks, Austrian attacks were repulsed with heavy losses, dashing their hopes of a swift victory and marking the first major Allied victories of the war. As a result, Austria had to keep sizable forces on the Serbian front, weakening its efforts against Russia. Serbia's defeat of the 1914 invasion has been called one of the major upset victories of the 20th century. In spring 1915, the campaign saw the first use of anti-aircraft warfare after an Austrian plane was shot down with ground-to-air fire, as well as the first medical evacuation by the Serbian army in autumn 1915. German offensive in Belgium and France. When the war began, the German order of battle placed 80% of the army in the west, with the remainder acting as a screening force in the east. The plan was to quickly knock France out of the war, then redeploy to the east and do the same to Russia. The German offensive in the west was officially titled Aufmarsch to West, but is better known as the Schlieffen Plan, after its original creator. Schlieffen deliberately kept the German left, i.e. its positions in Alsace-Lorraine, weak to lure the French into attacking there, while the majority were allocated to the German right, so as to sweep through Belgium, encircle Paris, and trap the French armies against the Swiss border. This strategy was actually helped by the French themselves, since their Plan 17 envisaged a major offensive into the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. However, Schlieffen's successor Moltke grew concerned that the French might push too hard on his left flank. Consequently, as the German army increased in size in the years leading up to the war, he changed the allocation of forces between the German right and left wings from 85:15 to 70:30. Ultimately, Moltke's changes meant insufficient forces to achieve decisive success and thus unrealistic goals and timings dubious. Discuss. French bayonet charge during the Battle of the Frontiers. By the end of August, French casualties exceeded 260,000, including 75,000 dead. The initial German advance in the west was very successful. By the end of August, the Allied left, which included the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was in full retreat. French casualties in the first month exceeded 260,000, including 27,000 killed on August 22 during the Battle of the Frontiers. German planning provided broad strategic instructions, while allowing army commanders considerable freedom in carrying them out at the front. This worked well in 1866 and 1870, but in 1914, von Kluck used this freedom to disobey orders, opening a gap between the German armies as they closed on Paris. The French and British exploited this gap to halt the German advance east of Paris at the First Battle of the Marne from 5 to September 12 and push the German forces back some 50 kilometers 31 miles. In 1911, the Russian Stavka had agreed with the French to attack Germany within 15 days of mobilization. This was unrealistic, and the two Russian armies that entered East Prussia on August 17 did so without many of their support elements. The Russian Second Army was effectively destroyed at the Battle of Tannenberg on 26–30 August, but the Russian advance caused the Germans to reroute their 8th Field Army from France to East Prussia, a factor in Allied victory on the Marne. Citation needed. By the end of 1914, German troops held strong defensive positions inside France, controlled the bulk of France's domestic coalfields, and had inflicted 230,000 more casualties than it lost itself. However, communications problems and questionable command decisions cost Germany the chance of a decisive outcome, while it had failed to achieve the primary objective of avoiding a long, two-front war. As was apparent to a number of German leaders, this amounted to a strategic defeat. Shortly after the Marne, Crown Prince Wilhelm told an American reporter, "We have lost the war. It will go on for a long time, but lost it is already."
Asia and the Pacific. On August 30, 1914, New Zealand occupied German Samoa, now the independent state of Samoa. On September 11, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force landed on the island of New Britain, then part of German New Guinea. On October 28, the German cruiser SMS Emden sank the Russian cruiser Gemhug in the Battle of Penang. Japan declared war on Germany prior to seizing territories in the Pacific, which later became the South Seas Mandate, as well as German treaty ports on the Chinese Shandong Peninsula at Tsingtao. After Vienna refused to withdraw its cruiser SMS Kaiserin Elizabeth from Tsingtao, Japan declared war on Austria-Hungary as well, and the ship was sunk at Tsingtao in November 1914. Within a few months, Allied forces had seized all German territories in the Pacific, leaving only isolated commerce raiders and a few holdouts in New Guinea. African campaigns. Some of the first clashes of the war involved British, French, and German colonial forces in Africa. On 6–7 August, French and British troops invaded the German protectorate of Togoland and Cameroon. On August 10, German forces in Southwest Africa attacked South Africa. Sporadic and fierce fighting continued for the rest of the war. The German colonial forces in German East Africa, led by Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, fought a guerrilla warfare campaign during World War I and only surrendered 2 weeks after the armistice took effect in Europe. Indian support for the Allies. Germany attempted to use Indian nationalism and pan-Islamism to its advantage, instigating uprisings in India, and sending a mission that urged Afghanistan to join the war on the side of Central Powers. However, contrary to British fears of a revolt in India, the outbreak of the war saw an unprecedented outpouring of loyalty and goodwill towards Britain. Indian political leaders from the Indian National Congress and other groups were eager to support the British war effort, since they believed that strong support for the war effort would further the cause of Indian Home Rule. Citation needed. The Indian Army in fact outnumbered the British Army at the beginning of the war. About 1.3 million Indian soldiers and laborers served in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, while the central government and the princely states sent large supplies of food, money, and ammunition. In all, 140,000 men served on the Western Front and nearly 700,000 in the Middle East. Casualties of Indian soldiers totaled 47,746 killed and 65,126 wounded during World War I. 88. The suffering engendered by the war, as well as the failure of the British government to grant self-government to India after the end of hostilities, bred disillusionment and fueled the campaign for full independence that would be led by Mohandas Gandhi and others.
Western Front 1914 to 1916. Naval War. At the start of the war, the German Empire had cruisers scattered across the globe, some of which were subsequently used to attack Allied merchant shipping. The British Royal Navy systematically hunted them down, though not without some embarrassment from its inability to protect Allied shipping. Before the beginning of the war, it was widely understood that Britain held the position of strongest, most influential navy in the world. 101 unreliable source. The publishing of the book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan in 1890 was intended to encourage the United States to increase its naval power. Instead, this book made it to Germany and inspired its readers to try to overpower the British Royal Navy. For example, the German detached light cruiser SMS Emden, part of the East Asia Squadron stationed at Qingdao, seized or destroyed 15 merchantmen, as well as sinking a Russian cruiser and a French destroyer. However, most of the German East Asia Squadron, consisting of the armored cruisers SMS Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, light cruisers Nuremberg and Leipzig, and 2 transport ships, did not have orders to raid shipping and was instead underway to Germany when it met British warships. The German flotilla and Dresden sank 2 armored cruisers at the Battle of Coronel, but was virtually destroyed at the Battle of the Falkland Islands in December 1914, with only Dresden and a few auxiliaries escaping, but after the Battle of Massa Tierra these 2 had been destroyed or interned. Battleships of the Hokusflot, 1917. U-155 exhibited near Tower Bridge in London, after the 1918 armistice. Soon after the outbreak of hostilities, Britain began a naval blockade of Germany. The strategy proved effective, cutting off vital military and civilian supplies, although this blockade violated accepted international law codified by several international agreements of the past 2 centuries. Britain mined international waters to prevent any ships from entering entire sections of ocean, causing danger to even neutral ships. Since there was limited response to this tactic of the British, Germany expected a similar response to its unrestricted submarine warfare. The Battle of Jutland, German, Skagerrakschlacht, or Battle of the Skagerrak, in May/June 1916 developed into the largest naval battle of the war. It was the only full-scale clash of battleships during the war, and one of the largest in history. The Kaiser-like Marines High Seas Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, fought the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, led by Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. The engagement was a standoff, as the Germans were outmaneuvered by the larger British fleet, but managed to escape and inflicted more damage to the British fleet than they received. Strategically, however, the British asserted their control of the sea, and the bulk of the German surface fleet remained confined to port for the duration of the war. German U-boats attempted to cut the supply lines between North America and Britain. The nature of submarine warfare meant that attacks often came without warning, giving the crews of the merchant ships little hope of survival. The United States launched a protest, and Germany changed its rules of engagement. After the sinking of the passenger ship RMS Lusitania in 1915, Germany promised not to target passenger liners, while Britain armed its merchant ships, placing them beyond the protection of the cruiser rules, which demanded warning and movement of crews to a place of safety, a standard that lifeboats did not meet. Finally, in early 1917, Germany adopted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, realizing the Americans would eventually enter the war. Germany sought to strangle Allied sea lanes before the United States could transport a large army overseas, but after initial successes eventually failed to do so. The U-boat threat lessened in 1917, when merchant ships began traveling in convoys, escorted by destroyers. This tactic made it difficult for U-boats to find targets, which significantly lessened losses, After the hydrophone and depth charges were introduced, accompanying destroyers could attack a submerged submarine with some hope of success. Convoy slowed the flow of supplies since ships had to wait as convoys were assembled. The solution to the delays was an extensive program of building new freighters. Troop ships were too fast for the submarines and did not travel the North Atlantic in convoys. The U-boats had sunk more than 5,000 Allied ships, at a cost of 199 submarines. World War I also saw the first use of aircraft carriers in combat, with HMS Furious launching Sopwith Camels in a successful raid against the Zeppelin hangars at Tondern in July 1918, as well as blimps for anti-submarine patrol.
Italian participation. Italy had been allied with the German and Austro-Hungarian empires since 1882 as part of the Triple Alliance. However, the nation had its own designs on Austro-Hungarian territory in Trentino, the Austrian littoral, Fiume, Rijeka, and Dalmatia. Rome had a secret 1902 pact with France, effectively nullifying its part in the Triple Alliance. Italy secretly agreed with France to remain neutral if the latter was attacked by Germany. Citation needed at the start of hostilities, Italy refused to commit troops, arguing that the Triple Alliance was defensive and that Austria-Hungary was an aggressor. The Austro-Hungarian government began negotiations to secure Italian neutrality, offering the French colony of Tunisia in return. The Allies made a counter-offer in which Italy would receive the southern Tyrol, Austrian littoral and territory on the Dalmatian coast after the defeat of Austria-Hungary. This was formalised by the Treaty of London. Further encouraged by the Allied invasion of Turkey in April 1915, Italy joined the Triple Entente and declared war on Austria-Hungary on May 23. 15 months later, Italy declared war on Germany. Romanian participation. Romania had been allied with the Central Powers since 1882. When the war began, however, it declared its neutrality, arguing that because Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia, Romania was under no obligation to join the war. On August 4, 1916, Romania and the Entente signed the Political Treaty and Military Convention, that established the parameters of Romania's participation in the war. In return, it received the Allies' formal sanction for Transylvania, Banat, and other territories of Austria-Hungary to be annexed to Romania. The action had large popular support. On August 27, 1916, the Romanian army launched an attack against Austria-Hungary, with limited Russian support. The Romanian offensive was initially successful in Transylvania, but a Central Powers counterattack drove them back. As a result of the Battle of Bucharest, the Central Powers occupied Bucharest on December 6, 1916. Fighting in Moldova continued in 1917, but Russian withdrawal from the war in late 1917 as a result of the October Revolution meant that Romania was forced to sign an armistice with the Central Powers on December 9, 1917.
Formal end of the war. A formal state of war between the two sides persisted for another 7 months, until the signing of the Treaty of Versailles with Germany on June 28, 1919. The United States Senate did not ratify the treaty despite public support for it 240-241 and did not formally end its involvement in the war until the Knox-Porter Resolution was signed on July 2, 1921 by President Warren G. Harding. 242 for the United Kingdom and the British Empire. The state of war ceased under the provisions of the Termination of the Present War, Definition, Act 1918 with respect to Germany on January 10, 1920. Austria on July 16, 1920. Bulgaria on August 9, 1920. Hungary on July 26, 1921. Turkey on August 6, 1924. Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos signing the Treaty of Sèvres. After the Treaty of Versailles, treaties with Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire were signed. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated, with much of its Levant territory awarded to various Allied powers as protectorates. The Turkish core in Anatolia was reorganized as the Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was to be partitioned by the Treaty of Sèvres of 1920. This treaty was never ratified by the Sultan and was rejected by the Turkish national movement, leading to the victorious Turkish War of Independence and the much less stringent 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. Some war memorials date the end of the war as being when the Versailles Treaty was signed in 1919, which was when many of the troops serving abroad finally returned home. By contrast, most commemorations of the war's end concentrate on the armistice of November 11, 1918. Legally, the formal peace treaties were not complete until the last, the Treaty of Lausanne, was signed. Under its terms, the Allied forces left Constantinople on August 23, 1923.
Peace treaties and national boundaries. After the war, there grew a certain amount of academic focus on the causes of war and on the elements that could make peace flourish. In part, these led to the institutionalization of peace and conflict studies, security studies, and international relations, IR, in general. The Paris Peace Conference imposed a series of peace treaties on the Central Powers, officially ending the war. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles dealt with Germany and, building on Wilson's 14th point, brought into being the League of Nations on June 28, 1919. The Central Powers had to acknowledge responsibility for all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by their aggression. In the Treaty of Versailles, this statement was Article 231. This article became known as the War Guilt Clause as the majority of Germans felt humiliated and resentful. 252 Overall, the Germans felt they had been unjustly dealt with by what they called the Diktat of Versailles. German historian Hagen Schultz said the treaty placed Germany under legal sanctions, deprived of military power, economically ruined, and politically humiliated. Belgian historian Laurens van Iepersel emphasizes the central role played by memory of the war and the Versailles Treaty in German politics in the 1920s and 1930s. Active denial of war guilt in Germany and German resentment at both reparations and continued Allied occupation of the Rhineland made widespread revision of the meaning and memory of the war problematic. The legend of the stab in the back and the wish to revise the Versailles Diktat, and the belief in an international threat aimed at the elimination of the German nation persisted at the heart of German politics. Even a man of peace such as Gustav Stresemann publicly rejected German guilt. As for the Nazis, they waved the banners of domestic treason and international conspiracy in an attempt to galvanize the German nation into a spirit of revenge. Like a fascist Italy, Nazi Germany sought to redirect the memory of the war to the benefit of its own policies. Meanwhile, new nations liberated from German rule viewed the treaty as recognition of wrongs committed against small nations by much larger aggressive neighbors. 255 The peace conference required all the defeated powers to pay reparations for all the damage done to civilians. However, owing to economic difficulties and Germany being the only defeated power with an intact economy, the burden fell largely on Germany. Austria-Hungary was partitioned into several successor states, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, largely but not entirely along ethnic lines. Transylvania was shifted from Hungary to Greater Romania. The details were contained in the Saint-Germain-en-Laye and the Treaty of Trianon. As a result of the Treaty of Trianon, 3.3 million Hungarians came under foreign rule. Although the Hungarians made up approximately 54% of the population of the pre-war Kingdom of Hungary, according to the 1910 census, only 32% of its territory was left to Hungary. Between 1920 and 1924, 354,000 Hungarians fled former Hungarian territories attached to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Russian Empire, which had withdrawn from the war in 1917 after the October Revolution, lost much of its western frontier as the newly independent nations of Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland were carved from it. Romania took control of Bessarabia in April 1918.